Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Aaron Stein, Chief Content Officer at War on the Rocks, and what follows is Aynne Kokas, the C.K. Yen Professor at the Miller Center and Associate Professor of Media Studies at the University of Virginia, talking about her latest book, Trafficking Data, How China is Winning the Battle for Digital Sovereignty. The conversation touched on digital privacy, how China exploits its own national laws to extract data, and what that means for the United States and security. It's truly a fascinating conversation. Enjoy.
It's really a delight to be here at UT. I'm very, very excited to have the opportunity to talk with all of you about my book. This has been so this book actually grew out of my first book, Hollywood Made in China. You may not guess it from the difference in topics, but as I was mentioning today at breakfast, one of the big challenges when you're writing a book is figuring out how to end it and what the scope needs to be. And so when I was finishing Hollywood Made in China, I was debating if I would include streaming platforms and their impact or their lack of impact on the Chinese market in the book. And one thing that became clear in discussions with friends and colleagues was that the issues that streaming platforms were facing in the Chinese market were very different than the issues that theatrical entertainment was facing within the Chinese market. And largely that had to do with the type of data that they were able to gather as part of the course of their business. So that actually formed the foundation of this book, which initially was going to be called Networked Chinawood, where I'd be talking about the digital relationships between the entertainment industries. But then with each passing moment, as I started to do more my research, it became clearer and clearer that this was a much bigger issue than just the entertainment industry. And so that's how I got to trafficking data. Just to give you an overview of the book, my main argument is that U.S. regulatory fragmentation, the Silicon Valley's data lust, and Wall Street's addiction to growth have fueled the expansion of the Chinese government's digital realm. Now, the thing that I really want to emphasize here, and I think is most important to emphasize at the core of this book, is that China, and this is work that Sheena is doing currently looking at China's expansive vision of national security and of digital security. One of the things that we see is that while in a lot of U.S. policy discourse, there's a huge discussion about China's expansive digital realm, one of the key points for the reason why the Chinese government and Chinese firms are able to expand their digital realm is because of a lack of digital oversight in a U.S. context. And the reason why I want to emphasize this is because it's the sort of thing that often gets lost, first of all, in policy debates, and it's the sort of thing that the people in this room are much more capable of affecting than what's happening in Beijing. And so I think when we're talking about these issues, it's important to not just look at what China is doing, but also what the US is not doing with respect to the growth of the digital realm. And also the ways in which, frankly, many of us in this room have benefited financially from the lack of oversight in digital spaces in the U.S. through growth of 401k balances and the rapid growth of the tech sector in a U.S. context. So there are these really tricky dynamics that are very much part and parcel of how the U.S. system of innovation and financial growth works that also enable a more expansive Chinese digital realm. And so I think that if you take away nothing from this talk apart from that, that would be the kind of core thing that I want you to remember. So what China has done is essentially expand a very robust vision for what encompasses this idea of digital sovereignty, or as it's translated in a lot of Chinese policy documents as cyber sovereignty, that encompasses things like government data, corporate data, and individual user data. Now, this is a vision of thinking about the world not just as terrestrial, or not just in terms of its physical borders, but also in terms of its digital borders. And so in many ways, this is a very forward-looking vision of what constitutes the state, what constitutes sovereignty, broadly speaking. And we're seeing this evolve in the European Union, in Japan, in Australia, in Korea. But actually, these policy discussions about what constitutes the digital state have been absent from a lot of US policy discourse. And now we're in a moment where there's a renewed focus on things like elections coming up and political challenges within the U.S. Congress. And so as a result, this is even taking further steps back from discussions and serious debates about these issues within a U.S. national context. So we're at a very interesting moment, and so I'm very glad to be able to be here to talk with you all about this, and to think about very clearly what are the implications of the US's role in this global landscape where China is increasingly developing an expansive extraterritorial vision of digital sovereignty. Before we get started, though, one thing that I really want to highlight is I'll be talking about US-China relations, and there's a very complex environment in the landscape of US-China relations right now. And one of the key issues that we encounter is any discussions about the Chinese government can then filter into our discussions, have filtered in the popular discourse into discussions about Asian Americans and Asian American communities in the US. So I'm saying all of these things in a backdrop of increased violence and increased attacks on Asian American communities in the United States. And I want to be very, very clear also at the beginning of this talk that when I am discussing the activities of the Chinese government and of Chinese corporations, that it's essential to completely disaggregate this from discussions of domestic communities here in the US. And I'm happy to talk about why this type of discourse has evolved or the complexities of it. But one of the things that I think is really essential whenever talking about these issues that can devolve into very hyperbolic discourse is to really focus on kind of narrow policy discussions that are occurring in Beijing and in Washington, and to try to remove the focus from local people and from domestic issues. So with that, one of the things that I want to talk about here is this idea of data trafficking, which is the core concept of the book. And the core idea is that data trafficking is an extractive process that exploits corporate data to share with third parties with limited user consent or acknowledgement for the purposes of gaining government control. And so this is not just surveillance capitalism or this idea that companies are able to gather a lot of data. This isn't just government surveillance where governments might be spying on individuals. It's specifically leveraging fragmented and unclear consent processes in consumer and corporate user data practices to extend national control through corporations. And so I want to really kind of create a narrow lane here about what we're talking about and how I conceive of data trafficking. So it's not all data movement, it's not all non-consensual data movement. It's data movement that specifically occurs through these non-consensual or very unclear consent frameworks that have been really founded and popularized by Silicon Valley firms. And so this is another key point to think about. A lot of these issues and a lot of the issues with data trafficking emerged as a result of this cultivation of digital resignation, corporate cultivation of digital resignation among users that was pioneered by US tech firms. And so firms like TikTok or WeChat would be much less successful in their ability to extract user data were they not able to build on those existing traditions of data exploitation that were pioneered in the US. And so again, when we're thinking about what China is doing, it's also important to think about how this built on cultures of digital practices that were developed in the United States. So when we're thinking about all of these issues, we also need to think about what data is. And there are a lot of different ways that we can conceive of this technically, but one of the things that, but looking at this from a humanistic and social scientific perspective, I also want to look at this from a metaphorical or product-based perspective. So some of the key ways that scholars have looked at this is this idea of data as a new oil. So this idea that it's something that can be extracted, a resource. And in many ways, the extractive politics of data mirror the extractive politics of a lot of other extraction-based industries. And this was something I learned a lot about when I was living in Houston, the different types of self-regulation that corporations in these extractive industries try to pioneer and in order to drive maximum profitability. And in many ways, and this is something that both people in Texas and people in California hate when I say, so I just want to let you know, it's not just the Texans and it's not just the Californians. In many ways, these practices of self-regulation that occur in the digital spheres and in the energy industry really mirror one another. So we see a kind of a focus on corporate profitability and corporate self-regulation as driving industrial practice. And one of the other reasons for that, and this doesn't exist in a vacuum, one of the big reasons and one of the very good reasons for it is that a lot of these, both the energy industry and in the digital industry, we see a landscape, in the tech industry, we see a landscape where regulators are very far behind companies in terms of their understanding of how the technology works. So as a result, there is a need for industrial self-regulation in order to better manage that, in order to better manage those technologies. However, what that also does is create a space where extraction can occur sometimes without the level of oversight that would be in the public interest, but rather would be more in the corporate interest. And so this is in many ways a feature of the US industrial ecosystem that has also enabled more expansive data trafficking practices. So we can also think about data as infrastructure. So any of you who have used, ChatGPT or have been following the SAG and the WGA debates know that inputs and data can form the foundation of new products and new infrastructure for developing new products. And so we can also think about, when we're thinking about why data trafficking is important, thinking about data as infrastructure. Finally, we can think about data as an asset. And this was actually something that was truly fascinating when I was doing research, and I did not appreciate it until, so I always like to share it at talks. When you make a deal, when you agree to the terms of service for an app, you're not just agreeing to the terms of service with that company. You're also agreeing to the terms of service with their creditors. So if that company goes bankrupt, your data can then be sold through a very lightly regulated system of data brokers in the US context to whoever seeks to buy it as part of bankruptcy proceedings. So when you're agreeing to something, when you're downloading an app, when you're sharing your user data for convenience purposes, you need to think, do I trust that this company is still going to be solvent in 5 years or 10 years? Am I sharing data that I would feel comfortable with them selling to somebody else? So it's also, so we can think about data as an asset when we're moving forward with this. But also one of the reasons why I use the word trafficking is because we can also think about user data as a form of our humanity, as the kind of core features of who we are and why we are the way we are. Ways to predict our behavior, ways to understand us in intimate ways that might feel uncomfortable. How many of you have gone on social media and had a video fed to you where you were like, this is my niche in a way that makes me feel deeply uncomfortable? Yeah. So when we're thinking about this personal feature of social media or of data, this is also a key area. So this gets us to the uses of the word trafficking. So when we're thinking about trafficking, it's a multidimensional system that relies on a variety of different areas. So one is this idea of drug trafficking. What do people who use a lot of apps called? Users. How many of you have called yourself an addict of your platform? How many of you have had to do a detox from your apps? It's part of the feature of the system where these are addiction-based platforms that rely on users not necessarily acting in their best interests. There are also systems of trade that rely on these systems of exploitation to draw on increase data usage by groups or corporations. We can also think about this aspect of human trafficking or the exploitation of the body or labor through a non-consensual labor bargain. So when you are going on free apps, you are sharing data about yourself. You are feeding into those algorithms so that the next time someone gets a really creepy but strangely appropriate video, it is largely partially based on the data that you shared and how you were interacting with that algorithm. So this is a non-consensual labor bargain that you're engaging with to improve the apps or consumer products that you're using. We can also think about data traffic, or the movement of user data that platforms use to build more sophisticated algorithms for the purposes of monetizing their services. So the more users there are, the more monetizable an app is, or the more monetizable a service is. So this is why data traffic is really at the core of data trafficking. TikTok wouldn't matter if it didn't have any users. But because it has high amounts of data traffic, it becomes really important, both because there are more people engaging in this non-consensual labor bargain, there are more users that are compelled to use the app, and there's more data traffic to enrich ad revenues, for example. So this feeds into this idea of network effects and risk-based decision making. So what we can see is that through network effects, the more populous a network is, the greater its value. So this increases profit and margins, it expands user base, it increases the perception of a superior product, it attracts more third-party businesses and data sharing. And all of these lead to more powerful algorithms. Now, one thing that's really interesting here is we're operating in a U.S. risk-based model of decision making. So I know here in Texas we have I know that there's a TikTok ban at UT. We have in Virginia we have something that's like a watered down version of this, which is students can use TikTok, but faculty can't. So it really keeps our network very secure. So when we're thinking about these policies, it's quite strange. But one of the reasons why we have these strange policies across different states is this idea of risk-based decision making, where within a U.S. context, there's, rather than taking a more precautionary approach, where we see in the EU or Japan, an effort to essentially regulate in advance or in anticipation of risk. In the US, there's a focus on regulating in response to risk. But different states perceive these risks differently and also have different political landscapes that allow regulation of these risks differently. And so as a result, we've seen this really strange patchwork of data oversight over apps like TikTok, but not necessarily any kind of national protection of, against data exploitation of users. And let's be really clear about this. TikTok can still sell their user data to other states. So if people outside of Texas or people in Texas are using TikTok, TikTok can still gather data here, and they can also sell their user data to other apps or to other Chinese apps. So when it's a data broker industry, it doesn't really matter if you manage one specific app, because other companies can just sell that data to the same people. So it's a really interesting and complicated landscape, and I wouldn't want to be a regulator, and I would not want to be in charge of having to make these decisions. So I say this with a lot of sympathy to the people who are trying to make these decisions. But one thing that's really clear is that it's a complicated landscape, and the fragmented way the U.S. is approaching data security is not addressing these issues. So what we see is this kind of landscape of limited oversight resulting in the privatization of individual data. Also limited oversight resulting in the individuation of who and how people manage their user data. So a question that I often get when I give this talk is what should I tell my kids? How do I manage their privacy settings? How should I manage my privacy settings? But what it comes down to is if you aren't being protected nationally, you shouldn't have to manage your privacy settings by yourself. And also, how many of you have read a terms of service and understood it? Can anyone raise your hand? I mean, we have a couple of lawyers in the room, so maybe you've understood the terms of. Okay. I mean, there's even from my understanding in the law context, there's even a debate about whether or not the consent frameworks are of any utility at all, or if they're just kind of a trick. So we see this fragmented data regulations that has led to what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, or a business model that's run on user data collection. Now, all of this is the backdrop for understanding how the U.S. interacts with China's cyber sovereignty policies. So in China, unlike the U.S., where we see different data regulations in Texas and Virginia and North Carolina and Illinois, and for children under 13, and for health data, but not health data that's gathered through your Apple Watch, but just health data that's gathered through your relationship with your doctor, but then can sometimes be shared with your insurance, but only under certain circumstances. I mean, I could keep going. It's crazy how certain data is protected and others aren't. In China, we see national protection across a wide range of different areas. So all secure data that's generated, or all critical information infrastructure information that's generated in China needs to be stored on Chinese government-run servers. Most data generated in China needs to be stored on Chinese servers. The data security law, China's data security law, allows for and requires national security data audits for any firms operating in China, including non-Chinese firms. We also see the provisions for online internet governance. I always like to mention this in educational contexts because this creates civil and criminal national security penalties for anyone using, producing, or distributing content that violates China's national security, just using, producing, or distributing content online that violates China's national security anywhere in the world. So did you guys have Zoom school at all? Yeah, okay. So if you said something, so we had a lot of Chinese students at UVA that took school in China or that took classes in China for several months. So if they said anything when they were in China for their classes at UVA, they could be violating and could be subject to civil and criminal penalties for the violation of China's national security. If, for example, they were taking a Chinese history class that reflected negatively on China's, stated national security or a stated framework for history. So these are really complicated and very transnationally focused laws and policies. The key point here is that there's no statute of limitations. And as time passes, these are moving targets. So what constitutes a violation of China's national security? And I'm really eager for Sheena's book, which will be delving into this in great depth. But what constitutes China's national security is an evolving phenomenon. So these are really, really challenging, also transnational laws. There's also the Hong Kong National Security Law, which also imposes extraterritorial penalties on people for violating China's national security outside of Hong Kong. So things that I say here today could violate Hong Kong's national security law. So I think when we're talking about these issues, it's important to think about how the lack of protection in a US context for the digital rights of individuals also enables things like the provisions for online internet governance to persist. Because as students in the US, you don't necessarily have any counter rights or any kind of response to this. It's just whatever the Chinese government says is you are subject to, and there are not necessarily protections that you would have within a US context from those provisions. So when I talk about this, I like to think about data problems like climate problems. And one of the reasons why is because of the question that I just articulated to you before, that most people ask me, how do I solve this myself? How do I change my settings? How do I secure my router? How do I change the apps that I'm using? And it's very similar to questions like, should I drive an electric car? Should I use a metal straw? Maybe I'll become vegan. I mean, there are all these, it's not that any of these are bad decisions, but the point is, if we're making collective action requirements or solutions that require collective action, individual decisions, then it's not a pathway to success. And this is a key issue when we're looking at both data problems and climate problems. So, switching to being vegan when there is an infrastructure for changing the energy mix in the US is not necessarily going to move the needle that much. Changing your privacy settings when there isn't like a comprehensive national data privacy law in a US context isn't necessarily going to protect you that much. If data brokers can still gather your data from other apps, you're kind of wasting your time. Or at a very minimum, you're not maximizing it. Now, all of this occurs in an environment of intense regulatory asymmetry between the US and China, and also uneven trading practices between the US and China. So, and this is a key thing that I think is important to realize. When there are these discussions about whether or not Chinese apps present a national security risk, this is a big question, and like how they do and in what ways. I'm happy to talk about that in greater depth. But I think that the regulatory asymmetry between the US and China demonstrates how the Chinese government at least perceives social media apps and data gathering, and that is as a national security risk. So US apps, for the most part, cannot operate within a Chinese context. There are really significant restrictions on the ways in which US companies can store their data in China, and what data can leave, how data can be protected, in ways that Chinese firms do not face in a US context. And I think more than anything, what that demonstrates is even if the US does not consider these to be national security risks, China definitely does. in ways that where the Chinese government, the Cyberspace Administration of China, the laws and policies that I just outlined before, are putting a huge amount of emphasis and bureaucratic weight and legal power behind protecting China's digital realm that does not exist within a US context. And so when we're thinking about this, one of the things that I always wonder about is, looking at the competition between the US and China, looking at these as emerging technologies, as emerging areas of competition, why is the US not thinking about this more systematically rather than just trying to ban specific companies? And the answers are pretty obvious from what I was describing to you earlier, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that this is a country where there's a strong focus on industrial self-regulation. There is a strong focus on reacting to risk rather than anticipating it. But the question becomes, when we're looking at these frontier industries, as the Chinese government calls them, is that the right policy? And does that protect U.S. citizens? And the other key issue here is that there's a fundamental conflict of interest for tech firms operating in the U.S. So what we see is that firms that are operating in China and the U.S. have kind of competing interests. They're very interested and want to remain operating within a Chinese context. And Apple is a great example. In 2019 at the Consumer Electronics Show, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, they put up a big ad outside the Consumer Electronics Show saying what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, in response to the fact that they did not share the password of the San Bernardino shooter. And this was a kind of big statement on Apple's part related to their privacy policies. But 2 years prior in China, the moment that the cybersecurity law took effect, the Chinese government sued Apple, and they moved all of their user data, including all their iCloud data, onto Chinese Chinese servers, and that were accessible to the Chinese government. And so when we're looking at this, it's important to note that while the development of the U.S. Tech ecosystem, for a very long time, the interests of U.S. tech firms were very much aligned with the interests of U.S. national security. That is no longer the case. So the question becomes, how does this shift? How does this shift U.S. national security? How does this shift the relationship between the tech sector and the U.S. government? And what might be next steps, particularly when thinking about this vis-a-vis China? And this slide, I want to actually give special thanks to China for, because this was because we were talking about. So she participated in a book workshop that I hosted when this book was a very, very inchoate project. And one of the things that we were talking about in the book workshop was the illiberalism of the U.S. tech sector, and how essentially that illiberalism amplified the illiberalism how the U.S. tech sector's illiberalism was amplified in engagement with China, and how these kind of black boxes were actually empowered by both their relationship with the Chinese tech sector, and how that filtered back into an environment where companies wouldn't necessarily want to share their operations in the Chinese market more broadly. And so this was something that came out of the book workshop. So I want to be sure to acknowledge that and to express my gratitude. But ultimately, what we see is that the US-China tech relationship destabilizes global user data in really meaningful ways. So this isn't just about the US and China, though that's been the focus of my talk today. It's also that countries around the world have to choose between using Chinese apps and US apps as the leading actors in the global tech sector. So what we're seeing is countries are trying to assess, which type of risk do I want? Do I want a US corporate risk, or do I want to work with Chinese firms that might work with me more locally, but that also have a closer relationship with the Chinese government? And also, let's be clear, there remains a huge amount of skepticism about working with US tech firms because of their potential relationship with the US government following the Snowden revelations. So it's a very interesting dynamic when talking with friends and partners in places like Korea or Japan or Australia. Even more interesting when you go to places like the Middle East or Latin America, where there's a kind of deep skepticism about partnering with the U.S. on anything. So that's something I'll be working on for my next project. And so I'm eager if anyone has any thoughts or ideas there to learn more about your perspectives. But ultimately, preventing data trafficking is difficult because this system is already well established. I teach a class called the Data Ethics of TikTok at UVA, where we read the TikTok terms of service. My students learn about all the different ways their data is being exploited. They annotate it and go into great detail. We learn about data trafficking. We learn about digital resignation. And at the end, I say so you guys gonna get off of these apps? And they're like, absolutely not. How will I have a social life? How will I have friends? And so it's very sticky. So ultimately, data traffic empowers, the data traffic and these network effects empower continuing data trafficking, which is one of the other reasons why it's important for policymakers to act in this area.